John 14 to 17. That's where you can find it. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ."
I was 3 years old when my folks decided to move from central England to rural Canada. And this move had all kinds of different realities to it, but particularly for me, it was a challenging time because I was just at the age where I was learning how to speak and communicate. And in England, they talk a little bit different than they do here. I don't know if you ever noticed that. But as I came, I quickly fell behind with my language, and every aspect of English became hard for me. And this struggle that started at an early age actually has carried on and has followed me my entire life. Even today, I still struggle with my pronunciation and different things like that. You'll hear it every now and again, which I thought would be great for going into a career that does speaking in front of big groups of people on a weekly basis. I thought this would work out well. But there's many different times and examples this shows up, but one of them is that my THs, when I'm tired, I will mix them up with my Fs, and this happens here and there. Actually, a few weeks ago, I had a terrible sleep on a Saturday night, but Sunday came, and Sunday I was scheduled to communicate, so here I was. Sunday I was talking about a scripture that we were looking at, how God knows our thoughts. But I was tired, and I wasn't really paying that attention, or I wasn't concentrating as much as I should. Instead of saying God knows our thoughts, I said God knows our farts. And nobody laughed, except for those that knew me and thought that was funny. But now as I think about it, it's still theologically correct. God does know our thoughts and our farts, and he knows when you pass gas and what you're thinking about as you do it. Our production lead, thought this was a great moment to splice that out of the whole sermon and put it on a thread to a bunch of us to show us, just to remind us in case we forgot. These are the moments when you realize who your true friends are in life. Needless to say, language and words have always been a struggle for me, especially when I started school. The first couple years of school, I dragged behind the class. My pronunciation was poor, my reading was delayed, and my writing was unrecognizable. I almost failed grade 1, but my mom convinced the teacher that if we did this journal exercise where I wrote and did some things over the summer to let me carry on to grade 2. And grade 2 arrived, and I was well behind the class, well behind where I should be with my reading and writing and all those pieces. But in grade 2, I met Miss Whitman. She was my teacher that year. And she had a different approach to teaching, and she had a different rhetoric with me that was unusual and not what I was familiar with. At this stage, I felt like a constant disappointment, a constant failure, never being able to achieve or be able to understand what the class was doing. But she looked at me, and she consistently told me that if I worked hard, if I applied myself, that I could achieve. She said, "Jordan, you're a smart, imaginative kid." I don't know if anyone said that to me before in my life, but she did. Actually, if you look at my report cards in grade 2, you see the first term, I am failing, and I'm far behind in all the areas around English. But throughout that year, her consistent belief in me, her consistent faith in me, her consistent communication and words that she spoke over me that, "Jordan, you can do this, you just need to try and apply yourself," gave me the motivation to work hard and continue. And so much so that my final term, my report card of that year, I greatly improved. The letters went in the right directions, and so much so that I was able to go on to grade 3. This is what she wrote in my final report card that year. She said, "Good work, Jordan. I'm very proud of your hard work. It has paid off. Jordan, you were a gift to our class." Her words, in so many ways, changed my life. They were the exact words that 6-year-old boy who was struggling, who couldn't keep up, needed to hear. They, in the very essence of those words, gave me a new life. The ancient Proverbs speaks about the significance of words, and this is what it says. The tongue, the proverb says, has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. In other words, the words you communicate, words have weight behind them. They have power behind them. They have power of life and death. The reality is our lives and the trajectory of our lives for many of us are influenced by words that have been spoken over us, or sadly, words that were never spoken over us. As you grow up and you begin to do some of the deeper work of your life, and maybe you sit down with a professional, or you just start kind of unearthing the realities of who you are, you'll find that a lot of your motivation in life is developed by these scripts that you have in your head. Scripts like, I'm not enough, I'm unlovable, I need to do more, I don't matter. And the reality is that so many of these scripts that form and shape so much of how we think has been formed by just a few words or a sentence that was spoken over us by one person in one time of our life. A few words, one sentence has shaped so much of how we live. It's the reality that a few words can shape an entire life. Eugene Peterson, in his paraphrase of this section in the Message, he says it this way: words kill. Words give life. They're either poison or fruit. You choose. Wow, eh? That's a lot of responsibility we have with the words that we use and don't use. That the words that we say to one another can destroy or bring life. So much responsibility, but here's the interesting part about words and communication is that most of us have not received or received very little or no training around how to communicate and have conversation and the importance of words. Such a fundamental part of life with such serious implications yet, but in high school or even post-secondary or college, there's very few courses that teach us how to communicate, how to listen, how to converse with one another. Some of us didn't realize that we were terrible at communication until we got married. We thought we weren't that bad. And then we realize as we begin to have more conversations with someone in a closer proximity that they demonstrated our lack of listening, our lack of ability to be emotionally available or converse, or our lack of ability to have a conversation that was stretching or that was harder. Some of us grew up in families where we didn't talk about anything. In fact, the MO was we don't talk about anything. We just sweep everything underneath the rug, and that works. That's fine. Why would we rock the boat? Some of us grew up in families where we talked about everything. But we didn't talk about everything. We debated about everything. We yelled about everything. We yelled so loud for so long, so we would just yell over everybody else's opinions, and that's how we would communicate, and we would yell, and then we would just finish, and then we'd move on like nothing happened. See, words, especially words spoken to one another, is one of the vital parts of being human. And I think that's why the New Testament writers talk so much about how we discourse and have conversation with one another. Because our discipleship to Jesus has implications to how we communicate, how we have conversations. Today, in the beginning of October, we're starting a new series titled Hard Conversations, Learning to Communicate in a Complex World. This series we're going to spend several weeks over with different guests who come in and speak about the different realities and different subjects around hard conversations. But this is going to take us all the way to middle of November, when we actually have Next Gen Sunday, where the kids and the youth take over the service. It's going to be a blast. You want to stick around for that. But as we go through this series, our small groups will also be discussing and dialoguing and having conversations around this. With so much of how we do church, we think that church should be less about a monologue and more about a dialogue. And so you all have experience around conversations and words and communication. And so make sure, if you're not part of a small group, or you are, to attend over these next few weeks as we wrestle with this subject. But for today, we're simply creating an introduction, a foundation for us to build the rest of this series on. And we're going to look at that in two parts. The first one is the state of conversation, and the second one is the example of Jesus. The state of conversation, and then the example of Jesus. First, the state of conversation. How do you feel about the quality of discourses today? There's lots of challenges and complexity around it, isn't there? I think there's many reasons for this, but I want to outline 3 cultural factors that I believe are creating some of this complexity. The first cultural factor is, I would title it as busyness. The reality is, conversations, they take time. And especially hard conversations, important conversations. They're not the kind of conversations that you can rush through and just have in 5 minutes. They take time. And with the busyness of life, and all of us being much busier than we maybe were in previous seasons, to have conversations of becoming more and more short and quick. And that only allow us to tackle surface level issues and never really get to the heart of the matter. See, the challenge with limited communication that we have with one another is that is often when misunderstanding and hurt happen. More often than not, when a relationship experiences tension, and think about that for a moment. Think about the relationships you've had. Think about when there's been tension in those relationships. More often than not, it happens because of miscommunication, a misunderstanding of what was said or what wasn't said. And the reality of us being busier and life being chaotic, and work and home and kids and all the different things, we have less time to sit down and have conversations. The average American family 100 years ago spent 90 minutes over dinner. The average today in an American household is 13 minutes. We have less time to sit down and connect and have deeper conversations. I was talking with a couple about the challenges of marriage and how they are well aware of the challenges they have. They're well aware of the conversations that they need to have. They're even aware that these conversations are important and they need to have them and they want to have them, but they just can't seem to find time to sit down to have those conversations. They're not alone. On average, each couple, each week, spends 35 minutes in conversation per week. So the first factor is our busyness has got in the way of us having deeper, longer conversations. The second reality is the digital world, of course, because the phones are the problem with everything, right? But in many ways, the digital advancements we've experienced has changed how we communicate to one another in positive ways. I remember in high school, when I was interested in a girl, the only way I would be able to communicate with her was to run on home and to dial up to the internet. Some of you didn't even know that. Some of you, the internet's always available in your pocket, but at one point we had to dial up. We had to connect to it. It took 5 minutes. It made all these weird noises. And it also took out your landline. So if your mom wanted to use the phone, or if she accidentally picked up the phone right when you got on, then you'd have to start the whole process again. We use something called MSN. Some of you are familiar. Some of you don't even know what this is. And you'd get on. There would just be this little image, this little emoji, not really emoji, it was before emojis. It was like this picture of this person that was gray, and if it went green, it means she was online and she wanted to chat. So we'd say, hey, what's up? Now we got all these convenient ways of communicating with one another, and so much of it is positive, like parents get to FaceTime, or grandparents get to FaceTime their grandkids if they live in a different city, but there are downsides. There are downsides in the convenience that communication has been made through these digital upgrades. One of them is through text. Many of us communicate through text. Even my dentist will text me, and my mechanic will text me. They'll text me about all kinds of different things, mostly around my teeth and my car, but text messaging has just become the norm of how we communicate, but we know text messaging can be complicated. It's missing tone. It's why we created emojis. So when we say that statement and we put a smile emoji at the end, they know that we're not mad at them. We put the smile emoji. Amy says sometimes that's the wrong emoji. That means something, so I'm figuring it out. But the reality is, these conversations become challenging with text messaging. Some individuals, like video calls has become new, especially since COVID. Many of us work remote, and most of our meetings are over video calls. Even many people, as I'm connecting, they want to meet over video call. Can we do that? And sometimes that's the best option, but if possible, I always prefer to meet in person. And the reason is that so much happens even before the call. So much happens as you wait in line for your coffee or the walk to the car, these conversations that happen, these checking in outside of maybe the agenda of what the actual meeting is about. And especially, again, if you're trying to have harder conversations, they're really hard to have over a digital platform where so much of body language and tone and just being present with someone is missed. In her book, Village Effect, Susan Pinker gives a mountain of evidence that it's not just the content of the message that matters, but the medium as well. She gives this chapter after chapter of just explaining how the research is demonstrating that our bodies physiologically respond different with someone being embodied in the room versus digital formats. That our body actually responds to someone who's with us and present in real life than through any other medium. The digital world has changed how we communicate. Third and lastly, polarization. Polarization certainly has changed conversations today. Now, scholars will disagree whether it is actually real polarization, that we are actually becoming more divided as a society, or if it's just simply the appearance of polarization because the extremes have been more elevated in social media and different things. Nevertheless, we do feel like rhetoric has changed a bit, that things have become more divisive. We're actually devoting a whole Sunday discussing learning to disagree. But simply put, for today, our language has become more combative and toxic. From politics to online comments to many of us becoming less tolerant of opinions that differ from ours. We have lost the art of having meaningful conversations with individuals we disagree with. And the result is that we do not engage with those that we differ with. And the problem is that when we do not engage with people who think differently than us, then the stereotypes that we have about them just continue to remain. One of the greatest ways is to destroy a stereotype about a certain person or a certain political idea or a certain way that somebody thinks. The greatest way to break that stereotype is actually to sit down, have a meal, and have a conversation with them. We dehumanize them when we don't have these conversations, and they're just simply a political point or simply just a person with a certain ideology. But conversations, they break so much of that up. Society applauds you for cutting people out of your life who disagree with you. But is that the Jesus way? Is there a way for us to engage hard conversations with others that is loving? Is there a different way for us to communicate in the 21st century? And this leads us to the example of Jesus. Jesus consistently modeled a different way to dialogue with others. If you read the biographies of his life, you'll be surprised to see how much he engages with others with depth and be able to connect with them on a personal, deep level. In fact, he spoke to those who were in the fringes with compassion that would be shocking in the present day in which he lived. But also at the same time, he spoke to the religious leaders with such directness that would make anyone listening blush. See, the biographers demonstrate how Jesus consistently had meaningful conversations, that so much of what he did was to have deep, sometimes hard conversations with people. Years later, after the first three biographers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, write their accounts, their biographies of Jesus' life, and they're in circulation, we have the character John who comes on the scene. Now, John knew Jesus way better than any of the other biographers. He was one of Jesus' closest friends while Jesus was here on earth. And John takes decades later, after the first three accounts of Jesus' life, to write his account, his portrayal of who Jesus is. And because he took such a long time, he takes longer to have this more poetic overview look. Where Matthew begins with genealogies and Luke begins with history, he begins with this poetic overall observation of who Jesus is. It's why scholars always say John's gospel is so much different than the first three. John begins to describe the significance of Jesus coming to earth and who Jesus is in a way that was way different than the other ones. He has this beautiful poetic thing talking about the word logos and what it means. But I want us to drill down in verse 14 of chapter 1 of John today and the significance around how we have conversations with one another. This is what it says. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John says here, listen, if you want to know who God is, well, God became flesh. The Word became flesh. God became man, and he has become among us. And how is he known? How do we describe who God is? What does he look like? How is he known? Well, he's full of grace and truth. Not a balance between the two, but full measure of both. He's not half grace and half truth. No, he's full of grace and he's full of truth. In other words, Jesus can be best summarized as someone who demonstrated both fully grace and truth. And this is especially true in his language and the words that he spoke to one another, that he spoke to individuals. There are many examples of this I could show you within the biographies of Jesus' life, but I want to show you one that's just chapters later in John's account of Jesus' life. It's found in chapter 8 of John. There's this scene where this woman's caught in adultery. She's caught right in the act of adultery, and the religious leaders grab her. They drag her out, maybe by the hair, maybe she's barely wearing any clothing. We don't know, but they bring her before Jesus in the public setting. They throw her at her feet and say, this woman's caught in adultery. You know what the law says. We are to stone her. Jesus, in his brilliance, always asks questions, and he says, okay, those of you who without sin, you throw the first stone. Of course, none of the religious leaders were able to follow through with this. They drop their stones and they leave, and this woman's on the ground, and she's probably full of tears, thinking her life is at its very end. Embarrassed through this whole ordeal. And Jesus says this interesting phrase to her. He says, I don't condemn you. Now leave your life of sin. Leave your life of sin. He first says, listen, this is sinful, that you've made poor decisions. Truth, right? But I don't condemn you. I don't give you what you deserve. I have grace for you. This little interaction, Jesus spoke with truth and grace at the same time. So what does it mean for you and I to model after Jesus, to speak with grace and truth? Well, first, grace. It means having a gracious approach to people. Jesus had a gracious view of people because he had a deep compassion for them. The biographers write about this a lot, that what was motivating Jesus and how he engaged with people of all kinds of different places and societies, because he had a deep compassion for them. And so he spoke to those who most people in society would ignore. And his posture was always one that asked lots of questions, and he gave invitations. He cared for individuals. In fact, this is where we get the expression to have a gracious view of someone. A gracious view of someone is assuming the best of them, not the worst. Let me give you a quick thought experiment. When you're late to work, I know you're never late to work, but if you were late to work You probably would think, well, traffic was crazy today, unnormal. Oh, I just had the worst night. I must be coming down with something. Oh, my kids, like chemistry experiment that they were going to take just exploded on the. You have all kinds of excuses. When your colleague's late to work, so disrespectful. Patricia, always late. This is classic. This is how she deals with so much things in her life. Right? Jesus had a gracious view of people. He was full of grace. Are we gracious with people? Are we kind in how we speak to them? Do we build people up? Are we curious in our dialogue? Do we ask lots of questions? Do we see the person that we're having a conversation with on the other side of us as simply someone with an ideology or someone we disagree with or someone that frustrates us? Or do we see them as image bearers? Is made in the image of God and have value and is someone that we are to have compassion for. Jesus spoke with grace. But Jesus also spoke with truth. See, Jesus spoke often with truth. He wasn't indirect or shy from being honest with people. He spoke truthfulness to the reality of what's going on. See, he knew that not being truthful didn't actually help anyone. And many of us, I think today, especially in passive-aggressive, kind Canada, we have this tendency to talk on the surface and not address what's really going on. But Jesus demonstrated to love someone is to be truthful. The other day, Amy and I were at a coffee shop, and we go on Friday mornings, and I was just reading my book, and there's a group of moms next to me, and probably their babies were all under 3 months, a young babies, young group of moms just connecting. And they were having some great conversation about P. Diddy and why this is going on and the different news reports that they heard and inside sources that they have that apparently mainstream media did not know about. Different TikToks that they saw, all of this great information. And not that we can't have conversations about P. Diddy or what have you or cultural different things. But I just was wondering, with this young group of moms, some of them, this is their first child, and probably all the challenges that they were having around being a new mom. And I wonder if there was a deeper conversation, a more truthful conversation that would be more beneficial, more loving for them to have in that time. Maybe they only meet once a month or once a week. And what a shame that there was an opportunity for them for truth and to be felt, to be seen, to go deeper, and that was missed because P. Diddy was the conversation topic. See, many of us have a tendency to just remain on the surface, but I think Jesus got to the heart of the matter quite quickly. He spoke about deeper things, harder things. But I want to be clear, truthfulness doesn't mean honesty without thoughtfulness. Some of you are like, we need to be truthful, so I'm going to tell this person exactly what I think. I think questions we should ask ourselves, is this the right time to have this conversation? Am I the right person to have this conversation? How should I have this conversation? David Burke summarizes this reality between grace and truth. He says it this way, quote, "Truth without love is harshness. Love without truth is sentimentality. But if you can be completely honest with somebody in the context of loving support, well, it's there that you have a trusting relationship." Jesus' life modeled to us how we should engage with others in conversation, the way we communicate with them. But why does this matter? Why is this so important? Jordan, why are we spending weeks talking about dialogue and conversation? Why getting this right, why is that so important? Because how we talk to each other, the conversations that we have, so much of that has to do with the discipleship with our formation. Our words are not neutral, but they are gauges of our own spiritual condition. Let me explain what I mean here. Jesus has this fascinating scene where he's in trouble with the Pharisees. It's a classic theme in the life of Jesus. If you read, you'll see it all the time. Every story needs to have an antagonist. Anyways, but Jesus is in trouble because his disciples aren't following the cleanse rituals of like washing their hands before they eat and all this stuff. And the religious thought at that time is what makes us holy is about us following all the laws, and especially cleanliness. And we don't want to make ourselves unclean and not acceptable by God and blah, 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 blah. Anyways, he has this interesting comment that they are like, you're defiling yourself by not washing your hands and doing these right steps. And he responds to this and he tells the disciples about something about the spiritual condition. He says this, don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? That's a basic biological lesson of how these things work. These are the kind of conversations me and my son have often. But then he goes on, he says, but the things that come out of a person's mouth, the things that come out of our mouth, they come from the heart, and these defile them. What people say, what you say, is what your heart is full of. So how we talk to one another demonstrates what's going on deeper. It demonstrates the corruption, the pride, the contempt, the anger, and frustration all come out in the way we speak. Alan Jacobs, the great theologian, says this, words matter because words flow out of persons. Our words come from the depths of our heart and our soul, and they extend who we are. So why are we doing this series? Because how we talk to one another, the language we use with one another says a lot about how the Spirit is forming us more into the image of Jesus. Sometimes things should be left unsaid. But other times, leaving things, not giving voice to them, only continues to let it fester and create tension within us. I believe the way of Jesus is to have hard conversations with others with grace and truth. Often in many conversations I have with people part of our church, they'll tell me about a different dynamic that's happening in their small group or with a colleague or with their spouse or with a friend. And almost always, at the end of them telling me about a scenario, I say, it sounds like there's a conversation needed to have there. I push people a lot to have conversations with one another when there's tensions arise or when there's dynamics at play. Because us having the conversation, it forces us to take stock of how we actually feel about it. We can't step into a conversation until we've come to terms with our own jealousy or our own anger or frustration, or in other words, the condition of your heart. Why do you think Jesus spoke so much about this? Why do you think the New Testament writers speak often about the way you communicate with one another, not just your brothers and sisters in faith, but of all people? Because the way we communicate is one of the greatest ways for us, the indicators of the heart condition, and that's what Jesus was most concerned about. Jesus understood that our rhetoric says a lot about our spiritual health. And so avoiding conversations can be a spiritual chokehold in your life. Likewise, telling hard truths without love and intentionality can communicate a lack of spiritual maturity. There is a maturity that's needed here. But we, as a community, want to be the kind of people who model after Jesus and speak with truth and grace. So a few questions for you. I'm inviting the keys to come up, and I'm closing here. How do you feel about hard conversations? Because we're going to talk about it for 6 weeks. But how do you feel about it? How would your language look different if you let Jesus form and shape this area of your life? If you let Jesus form and shape in this area of your life, what would look different in the way you speak? And not just in this place, but at your work, and with your spouse, and with your friend, and your roommate, and at your school, and at your workplace, all the different dynamics of life. What conversations are you avoiding that you should have? I think the way of Jesus is to intentionally have the conversations that maybe everyone else is avoiding. I'm going to close this story. Several years ago, I had a colleague that I was working with. We'll call her Dana. And Dana and I worked together for a while at this point, but at some point in our relationship, I felt that there was this tension between us. And I couldn't fully figure it out. I just felt there was something there, and there was no incident that happened. There was no blow up. There was no conversation. I don't think I did anything, or there's nothing I could draw a circle around and say, oh, this was the moment where the tension arose. But I was younger then, and I would say things. I'd talk too much, and I have opinions, and I would just let them go, and maybe I would do something or not do something. Something I did or something I didn't do. I had no idea, but I just had a sense that there was some barrier between us, some tension. So I invited Dana to come to my office, and she's like, yeah, no problem. And we sat down, and I didn't waste any time. I went right to it. I said, Dana, I really respect you, and I really appreciate our friendship, but I feel like there's just tension between us. I feel like there's something between us. And listen, if I said something, I'm really sorry. If I said something that offended you or caused hurt or caused this tension, I'm sorry. Or if I did something or something I was supposed to do that I didn't do, I just want to own that. I just want to apologize. I just care too much about this relationship. Grace. She said, no, nothing. Everything's great. I'm like, are you sure? Yeah, everything's great. I said, okay, maybe it's just me. But before you go, Dana, I just want you to know that if there is something, if you do have some challenge with me, if we're going to have a productive working relationships, well, then you need to let me know what that is. We won't be able to work together. We won't be able to have a beneficial relationship if we don't have this conversation. That's fair and reasonable. She's like, yeah, of course, no problem. I apologized. I said, I'm sorry. We had a hard conversation. It was awkward. And to this day, I don't know what happened between us. But I do know that after that conversation, something shifted. Something changed. That tension, it seemed to diminish. In fact, that when we both left that workplace, she was one of my closest friends there. She was one of the people that I learned to trust and that we'd be able to build relationship and vulnerability with. In fact, when she left, she sat Amy and I down and she said the kindest things about us and who we were. Now, of course, not every conversation goes that way. But more often than not, in my experience, I see the Holy Spirit doing some of its best work in these kind of conversations. Jesus modeled to us the kind of conversations that matter. Do you have those kind of conversations? Because how we're building Forest City Church is by one conversation at a time. It's the slow work of having these deep, meaningful conversations because we believe that slow work builds its deep and meaningful relationships, which is what we're trying to create here. I'm going to invite you to stand if you're able. The team's coming. Our prayer team is coming as well. And we're going to conclude with a response. But as the team coming, I just would love to take a moment to pray for you. Heavenly Father, I thank you for my brothers and sisters. I thank you for every person in this room. And Jesus, I just pray for those they have wounds today. They have hurts. because words that have been spoken over them, things said about them, hurtful things, unfair things. Holy Spirit, I just pray that you would heal wounds today, that we as a community be reminded of the Father's love, that the Father says he's proud of you, the Father says he loves you, the Father says he has a purpose for your life, the Father says he is there present with you and he'll never leave you. May we replace the words that have been so damaging with the words of life from the giver of life. Jesus, may we do the harder work of having the harder conversations. May we be the kind of community that loves one another so much that we're willing to enter into the awkwardness, the challenge, the vulnerability of speaking with grace and truth to one another. May we be the type of people that are formed by the words we speak to one another, the words we say, but also the words we receive. May the language of this place be the kind of language that builds life. That's the fruit that we enjoy. It's the life in which gives us life. Yeah. We ask all these things in your beautiful name. Amen. The team's going to sing. There's a prayer team here. They'd love to pray with you. But would you just take a few minutes to respond this morning?